All right, so here we have a Ferrari Mondial T slash 348 dual mass flywheel. There's a couple of good videos here on YouTube about how to service these things and how to remove them off of the engine, but I haven't seen any good videos showing just what's inside these things and how they operate. So hopefully some people can get an idea with this little video, and they can go about fixing theirs, or at least understanding how this whole setup works. So I guess the idea that when Ferrari chose this setup for their 348 and 355 cars, because the way the clutch hangs off the back of the transaxle, it's quite some distance away from the engine, and the shaft itself, which goes into this small spline here, so it'll extend out in this direction towards the engine, and it's a good, maybe foot, maybe 14, 16 inches away to where the crankshaft would be. So in centimeters, probably think like something like, I don't know, 35, 40 centimeters away. And like this whole assembly, oh, lost the O-rings there. This whole assembly, that big, large boss extension there, that sort of gets pressed into a large bearing on the bell housing. And then it spins, it rotates off of that. And so, like, the input shaft goes through here, and then the clutch is attached to this whole assembly. This clamshell half gets bolted onto there, and then there's a cast iron flywheel that gets bolted on to the periphery of this, and then the clutch assembly is stacked on top of that. And the clutch discs have a much larger spline, and it gets connected to a concentric shaft, and that is what goes into the transmission and rotates the gears. So because it's sitting far away from the engine and the shaft itself is not that stout, I'm sure they chose this setup to sort of make it easier on the shaft so that it's not being subjected to harsh vibrating motions, which could easily snap the shaft. And it's not just this model of Ferrari, but there's others that have very delicate transmissions, so I'm sure this was one of the reasons why they used it. And also it's probably just for make it easier on the driver to operate, because I can tell you that working the clutch in this car, there's virtually no drag or none of the friction point that you would feel in a more traditional manual transmission car. That juddering sensation when you're letting the clutch out and it's just grabbing the plates and the flywheel and such. You don't feel that at all in this car. I actually stalled it the first couple of times driving it because I was expecting it to give that sort of sensation, and it didn't. I just let the clutch out, and then all of a sudden it's died, it stalled, because you don't feel it, because this thing sort of takes away that sensation and that motion. And basically inside here you see there's these collections of springs, and they fit into these pockets here like that, and there's 4 of them around. And then in these little holes there are these spring-loaded ramp-like pieces, and this is the other half, which would fit on that cover plate there like that. That gets installed on that side of it. So there's 2 ramps, and it basically prevents this from over oscillating, because when the bolts are through the case, there are these posts that are installed in between there, plus these spacer washers, and they're in these locations. And obviously you don't want this to over oscillate and damage that. So that's what these things kind of limit, that motion. And basically when there's a difference in rotation and that motion from the friction, when the clutch engages, this thing is going to shake like that. Okay, it's the outer case that will shake and judder, whereas this is, at a constant speed because the engine is constantly turning. So if there's that motion, it'll be doing this. Okay, and that's kind of the basic principle of how this flywheel works. And it's not just like empty components. There is a grease that's filled into all these cavities, and the grease basically dampens that motion. So instead of it being like hyperactive, it will slow down the movement of oscillations. I mean, we're talking, when this thing is spinning at several thousand RPM, there's a slight jiggling motion. So, there's a lot going on here, and you don't want it to be, vibrating at such a high frequency, because it may cause a resonance that would probably make it even harder to work the clutch. I'm assuming that, this is basically what I'm thinking of, how this system works. But in any case, you're supposed to use like a special grease made in Germany for this, but there's a few guys on Ferrarichat that have found that, even just normal grease is sufficient. And I'm going to be using Super Lube. It's that Teflon based synthetic silicone grease. So I'm going to be using that to fill this thing up. And you basically just fill up the empty areas with grease, and that will keep this thing, in check. And that's pretty much it for that. There's nothing special. Like I said, on Ferrarichat and elsewhere on YouTube, there's videos on how to rebuild these, how to pack the grease, and how much grease to use and all that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. This is just to show what this looks inside once it's all cleaned, and basically how this thing will work. Once I took this off my car and separated the halves and pulled this apart, this was just disgusting. The grease was contaminated by transmission oil, and that's the issue with this dual shaft setup here in this concentric shaft assembly, because the input shaft that goes into here, there is what's called triple seals, and it's just basically 3 seals in a row that are inserted into grooves on the shaft, and they seal off the rest of the transmission oil. But as they wear out, the transmission oil basically siphons its way through the shaft, and it hits the splines, and it just sort of spreads out, and it gets underneath the seal here, and it just soaks and saturates the grease, thinning it out. And not only does it make a mess when it starts spraying out the sides, but then it'll also change the way that this oscillates, and you'll have, starting and running issues and all that. So I'm going to be changing the triple seals on my transmission, and this fresh grease should make it run much, much smoother now. Okay, thanks for watching.